Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're going to be analyzing a really fascinating philosophical and theological text called Restful Waters. What's so cool about this piece is that it takes something incredibly ordinary, literally just the simple act of drinking a glass of water, and uses it to explore massive concepts like human longing, dissatisfaction, and ultimate fulfillment. So we're going to break down the author's arguments step by step and see exactly how this whole metaphorical journey unfolds. But first, let's start with a question. Why do we always want more, no matter how much we already have? It's such a universal human dilemma, right? You finally get that promotion, you buy the house, you hit a huge milestone, and for a fleeting second, you feel totally satisfied. But then, almost immediately, that familiar craving creeps right back in. Well, this is the exact phenomenon our source text is trying to diagnose. The author argues that this perpetual dissatisfaction isn't just some glitch in our psychology. Instead, it's actually a symptom of a much deeper, much older kind of thirst. Here's how the text maps it all out for us today. We'll be looking at 1, the village well, 2, the soul's deep thirst, 3, the illusion of satisfaction, 4, a deceptive stream, and 5, the ultimate spring. Let's kick things off with section 1, the village well. Interestingly, our text doesn't open with dense philosophy. It actually starts with a really grounded, relatable memory. The author describes this village well that sat right next to their childhood home. I want you to picture the intense heat of a blinding summer day. You've been running around, you're completely parched, and you step under the cool, inviting shade of a giant willow tree. You drop water from this deep, cold source and take a massive gulp. The author notes that the physical relief is just so instant, so incredibly powerful, that it brings out this specific exclamation, "I'm going to live." It's way more than just hydration. It's this visceral feeling of immediate revival. So the text takes that literal physical well, that sudden rush of feeling like, "I'm going to live," and elevates it to become the core metaphor for the entire piece. The author calls this concept restful waters. Now, according to the text, restful waters isn't a physical place you can map out and visit. It's a metaphor for a state of complete spiritual restoration. It represents that profound absolute relief we all desperately need from the deep exhaustion of just existing and navigating life. Which brings us to section 2, the soul's deep thirst. Here, the author sets up a pretty stark comparison. The text argues that every single human being experiences 2 entirely distinct types of thirst. On one hand, we've got physical thirst. We all know it, and it's easily, though temporarily, relieved by just drinking physical water. But on the other hand, we have spiritual thirst. The text defines this as a permanent existential longing. And the kicker is, you can't fix it with a glass of water. You can't fix it with a soda. Because it is fundamentally spiritual in nature, the author argues it absolutely requires a spiritual source to ever be quenched. To back up this whole concept of spiritual thirst, the text actually pulls from modern philosophy, specifically quoting Paul Keenan. He says, "There is a place in us that longs for something more, not more possessions, status, glory, or money." This perfectly captures that feeling of emptiness we were talking about right at the start of the explainer. The author is really driving home the point that this existential void is a universally recognized human condition. We are all searching for this elusive something more, and crucially, it's something material wealth just can't buy. Then, the text seamlessly bridges that modern philosophical observation with ancient scripture, quoting Psalm 42, "As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God." The context here is actually super fascinating. The psalmist wrote these words while living in exile, physically cut off from the temple, feeling this desperate, completely parched longing for the presence of the divine. So the author uses this to show that, whether we're looking at a modern thinker or an ancient poet, humanity has basically always recognized this deep spiritual dehydration. Let's move on to section 3, the illusion of satisfaction. So, if we all have this thirst, what happens when we try to quench it with the wrong things? Well, the author argues that throughout history, humans have desperately tried to soothe their spiritual thirst using what the text calls false waters. This includes things like money, honor, vanity, power, pleasure, and even empty religious rituals. The source material presents the view that pursuing these things is basically like chasing a mirage in a desert. From a distance, yeah, they might look like restful waters, but when you actually consume them, they leave your soul just as dehydrated as before. They simply lack the capacity to touch that underlying existential void. And that brings us to section 4, a deceptive stream. To really illustrate the danger of these false waters, the author shares this incredibly vivid story from their time in military service. They were on this grueling 200-kilometer march through the mountains. Picture the dead of summer. They're lugging around extremely heavy gear, and they are just pushed to the absolute limits of physical endurance. At about 11 p.m., totally exhausted, they finally get a quick rest. In the pitch black, using just a tiny flashlight, they spot a stream near the road. It looks clean enough, so they eagerly fill their canteens and just chug the water. But then, fast forward to 8 a.m. the next morning. The march loops them right back past that exact same stream. In the harsh light of day, they can see the water is actually completely filthy and contaminated. The author describes getting hit with this sudden, intense wave of nausea, just realizing what they'd swallowed in the dark. Years later, the author connects the dots to this metaphor. In the darkness of our own exhaustion, false waters often look like a perfectly safe resting place, but the reality can be deeply, deeply toxic.
So why are we so prone to falling for it? Why do we keep drinking from these deceptive, dirty streams? The text offers a very specific theological diagnosis for this. The author posits that human spiritual thirst stems directly from a separation from the Creator. The underlying argument here is that humans were originally designed to be spiritual beings, deeply connected to a spiritual source. When that connection gets broken or separated, the result is this intense, unending existential thirst. So we end up drinking from those deceptive streams simply because we are desperately, blindly trying to replace that original connection.
This leads us right into our final section, the ultimate spring. So here is the big question. Where can the spiritual thirst finally be quenched? If money, power, and status are merely deceptive streams that ultimately make us sick in the daylight, where does a person actually find those restful waters we talked about at the very beginning? The source material answers this climactic question by pointing directly to a theological conclusion. The author quotes the words of Jesus from the Gospel of John, chapter 4, saying, "Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring." The text argues that this is literally the only permanent solution. According to the author, Jesus Christ is presenting himself here not just as a quick, temporary drink, but as the ultimate, internalized spring of restful water that permanently cures the existential dehydration of the human soul. To show us how this actually looks in practice, the author references the biblical story of the Samaritan woman at the well, who happens to be the exact person Jesus was speaking to in that quote. The text breaks down her journey into 3 steps. First, she's someone who has fully experienced the bitter and sweet thirsts of life. She has spent years chasing after those false waters. Second, she encounters what the text calls the true spiritual spring, right there at the physical well. And third, and this is a really cool symbolic conclusion, her spiritual thirst is so completely satisfied that she actually leaves her physical water jar behind. The text basically uses her story as the ultimate proof of concept for finding restful waters. And that really ties together the core thesis of our source material today. The author neatly summarizes this with a quote from Joseph M. Stowell. "We were made for God. Only He can fill the void in our souls." Think about it. The entire journey of this text, from the cool shade of that childhood willow tree, through the agonizing thirst of the nighttime military march, all the way to the ancient well in Samaria, it all converges on this single argument, the idea that the design of the human soul requires a very specific source to ever find its true rest. Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought to end on. Based on all the metaphors we've explored today, ask yourself, are you currently drinking from a temporary, deceptive stream in the dark, just hoping it's going to satisfy you? Or have you found your restful waters? It really is a fascinating lens through which to view our daily pursuits and our deepest longings. Thank you so much for hanging out and exploring this text with me today. Keep analyzing, keep questioning, and I will see you in the next explainer.